Yesterday on this channel, I reported to you that the Vatican is in the preparation stage for releasing a new document allegedly to ban the traditional Mass, to be its final penultimate way of getting rid of the Mass itself. Likely, this means that diocesan Latin Masses will be gone, if this is true. The vast majority of Latin Mass going Catholics attend Mass at diocesan parishes. At least that was the case before Traditionis Custodes. And Traditionis Custodes restricted most overtly the number of diocesan traditional Latin Masses. These are your ordinary form parishes that might have a priest who also says the traditional Mass, and in rare occasions the priest there is dedicated solely to it. So it's a diocesan parish in every sense of the word, but that only offers the traditional sacraments. That was the news we talked about yesterday. And when talking about that yesterday, I gave you some possible dates for this. And we now have some confirmation for this. And it's at least confirmation in terms of other outlets reaching out to their sources in Rome. And they gave a date for this. So buckle up, because this is going to be a bumpy ride ahead. And in addition to that, we have information about the people behind the scenes from this. And spoiler alert, those behind the scenes responsible for this document believe that you and I are in schism from the church. That is what they believe, because we want the same faith as our ancestors. Because of that, we are the ones in schism. So again, buckle up, folks. Things are going to get interesting. And as one of the sources I am looking at, and we'll talk about briefly here, will attest, it's not just Latin Catholics they want to go after. There's an interview that dropped that is so breathtaking in just the bluntness of the modernist who's speaking to a non-modernist source that I have to go over it in at least 2 streams to keep my streams relatively short. But my Byzantine and Maronite and otherwise Eastern Rite brethren watching this who are Catholics, they're coming for you next. So let's start with LifeSite News, though, because this whole story makes a lot more sense if you understand it in the idea that the liturgy reflects what we believe. So, headline from LifeSite. Reports Vatican planning to enforce a final ban of traditional Latin Mass likely on July 16th, less than a month from now. Sources told Rorate Caeli that Vatican officials want to ban the Latin Mass in a manner as, quote, wide, final, and irreversible as possible. And a source informed LifeSite News that this ban is likely to be issued on the 3-year anniversary of Traditionis Custodes. That was one of the dates that I mentioned in my previous stream. For those who are familiar with your liturgical calendar, and you should all be familiar with it, even on the ordinary form liturgical calendar, July 16th is the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which is where we get the devotion to the brown scapular from. Our Lady of Mount Carmel, for those who've watched my Fatima videos, you will know that the brown scapular is key to the Fatima message. That you are to wear the brown scapular and say the little office to live the Fatima message according to Sister Lucia. That is not covered by the Sabbatine privilege. Sister Lucia made that very, very clear in interviews she did before she was silenced in the 1950s. Silenced either being, made to take a vow of silence until the Vatican was willing to have her publicly do things, or silenced in the euphemistic way, depending how you look at the questions surrounding Sister Lucia. But she made it very clear that wearing the brown scapular was part of the Fatima message, keeping the Fatima message, as was praying the little office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is apart from the Sabbatine privilege. The Sabbatine privilege has to do with all the promises that you are given if you wear the brown scapular. So this date was not chosen by accident. And this article goes into some detail here about mostly it begins with the backstory that we talked about yesterday. But then they give us this. So, quote, these Vatican prelates, which by implication include Pope Francis and at least require his consent, reportedly wish to make this Latin Mass ban as wide, final, and irreversible as possible. Rorate Caeli is urging people in all states of life to, quote, prevent the ban from becoming a concrete measure. They're doing that by telling you to pray, fast, and reach out to your bishop and tell them to resist this thing, basically. LifeSite News has received information indicating that a likely date for these expected restrictions is July 16th, the anniversary of the implementation of Traditionis Custodes. And July 16th is, by the way, that's a Tuesday, so that would be weird. They usually like to do these things on a Friday, but they also love their Marian feast days. Cardinal Raymond Burke recently highlighted the fact that Traditionis Custodes has in one sense backfired because it has intensified and multiplied attraction to the mass of the ages. The Cardinal stated, quote, "If the intention with the latest legislation, Traditionis Custodes, and other documents which followed it was to discourage or to decrease the attraction of the Holy Liturgy according to the Usus Antiquor, it had, I would say, the exact opposite effect. This," he added, "should not be surprising. One is to think that a form of the Roman rite which has nourished so profoundly and produced so many saints, the declared saints, even let's say hidden saints, it is not possible that this rite be canceled, that it be eliminated from the life of the church." End quote. Later it quotes uh, quote primum, the document from Pope St. Pius V, which infallibly appears to declare that you cannot suppress the traditional mass. You can't do it. A traditional form of the liturgy that developed organically from like the 4th century and really even from before then, as most liturgists will tell you, that if you went back to the first Christians offering their early masses in the catacombs and in private homes, you would have found at least the Roman canon there and a few other elements of the traditional mass. But it developed organically from apostolic times, regardless of what some people who don't know the first thing about liturgy will tell you, which is they try to say that the traditional mass was once a novus ordo itself. They literally have no idea what they're talking about when they say that. But the LifeSite article makes reference to some prelates who are working behind the scenes to ban the Mass. Rate Chaley came through with another great work of journalism on this and actually revealed the likely candidates. And to give it the actual credit where I think it's actually due first and foremost is, well, they came through with this, and there's another thing we'll go over here too. So let's turn to Rate Chaley for a brief update on what they found, because you might be aware that in Australia, the cathedral in Melbourne had actually asked to be able to keep its traditional mass. And the bishop wrote to Rome asking for a dispensation. It was one of the historic Latin masses in Australia, perhaps the most historic of them, that even through the dark times of the 70s and 80s, apparently you could get the traditional liturgy there. Got a letter back saying, no, you have to ban it. And then they gave him a time frame for which to do that. Well, Rate Chaley did some digging and found who this bishop is, who's behind that. And this is a character who would absolutely be involved in the working on the total and complete ban of the traditional mass. So we go here with this headline: Archbishop Viola, the violator of tradition, the dangerous secretary of divine worship, and the man behind the attempts to ban the traditional mass. It includes his letter to the Archbishop of Melbourne. He is the bishop behind the TLM ban at that cathedral. When that news came down, I didn't report on it, but it was all over social media. People were talking about that and completely flabbergasted that it happened, because there have been some exceptions made to Traditionis Custodes. Sort of. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, the exceptions that were made were done to keep, we're giving people, the bishops, the dioceses, more time, with the ultimate goal, if you've read Traditionis Custodes and the letter that went with it to the bishops, to bring people back to the Latin Mass. All the exceptions were meant to be temporary. All of them. We're all to be brought back to the Novus Ordo, to be taught how great and wonderful the so-called liturgical reform there was. And here's the character behind this ban, who is, I will guarantee you, if this is real, from Rome, that Rate Chaley, whose sources are impeccable on this, on liturgical matters, their news that they get from Rome has a 100% hit rate. They have been right pretty much every single time on this. We'll note something about this bishop here. So, from the article, quote, "Who is Archbishop Vittorio Francesco Viola? The secretary of the Dicastery for Divine Worship is said to be proud to wear the episcopal ring of none other than the devious creator of the Novus Ordo, Archbishop and suspected stonecutter Annibale Bugnini." I'm going to say suspected. Actually, the nuns who cleaned out his quarters after he was banished from Rome to the far-flung remote regions of the Middle East because according to Paul VI, he was banished for being something that was, quote, worse than being a stonecutter. The nuns there were cleaning out his room and found evidence that he was. People don't talk about that enough, I think. But anyway, we confirm today that he is the main dangerous, ideologically motivated cleric whose final intent is to completely ban the traditional Latin Mass. We could add much more in much more detail, but instead we'll present the translation of the post as published by the Italian religious blog Celere Non Possum, which is a website I use as a source all the time, and is a centrist. This is definitely not a traditionalist blog. This is not a, from some faction of traditionalists. Okay, this is more of just a Catholic blog that expresses concern about the state of the church. It's not ideologically aligned with us. This is on the appalling ban Viola imposed on the continuation of the celebration of the traditional Mass in the Cathedral of Melbourne, Australia, as if the Metropolitan Archbishop of Melbourne were some kind of naughty altar boy who is not in charge even of the liturgy in his own cathedral. The absolute opposite of the deceitful allegations contained in Traditionis Custodes. In the letter, he orders the bishop to celebrate only the Reformed liturgy in his own cathedral, but allows the use of a church, not the cathedral, if the faithful want to remain with the traditional rite. There's already an existing traditional parish in the diocese that is only unaffected by Traditionis Custodes because it had been instituted before it. So much for the bishop as the overseer of the liturgy in his diocese. And they actually have the full letter there. I don't think it's that important for this discussion, but you will see logic in it. If you want to read it, I'll have it linked to my show notes at returntotradition.org minutes after this live stream is over. But the question they ask here is worth pondering is, one has to wonder, so when bishops celebrate according to an unspecified rite that would like to ape that of Paul VI, does no one get outraged? When there are bishops who commit liturgical abuse and promote sloppiness, no one dares to write 2 lines. Now, this is a translation, kind of rough, but the point is, you have seen unequivocally liturgical errors and misuse of the liturgy to the point where the new Mass, when celebrated by some of these priests, doesn't even look like the new Mass. It looks like a clown show. And they never get corrected. There are reasons for that. Again, read Traditionis Custodes. There's a contradiction in Traditionis Custodes, several of them really, but one that's glaring. One that calls for the celebration of the new Mass in a way fitting for to be fitting of the liturgy as a liturgy of the Catholic Church, while at the same time saying that the traditional Mass, there can be no accretions from the traditional Mass, meaning no influences from the traditional Mass on the Missal of Paul VI. They say that in there. So you cannot, it's like they're having it both ways. And that's why you don't see them, these priests, these bad actors, getting corrected ever. Now, that all having been said, we're going to turn to something that was very, very eye-opening. And Rorate comes through, again, but I'm going to show you the original source first. This is from Mesa in Latino, a website, Mass in Latin. They sat down with one of the most notorious modernists in the liturgical sphere for an interview, and they asked him hard, tough questions. This is a traditionalist blog. And to Mr. Grillo's credit, he gave them as good as he gave back as good as he got. He gave them the hard line answers from that side of things. And I'm going to tell you right now, this interview is so out there that I'm going to need to revisit this probably tomorrow. And this is where I'm going to give you a hint. Greek Catholics, Byzantine Rite, Syro-Malabar, whatever it is, the modernists, when they're done with us in the Latin West, are coming for your liturgy next. It's revealed here in this interview. That's not the main topic for this. So the translation is a little rough. Rorate does give us a better translation when they publish the same interview with their permission. So we go back to Rorate Caeli with this headline. Andrea Grillo, an astonishing interview of the main lay ideologue behind Traditionis Custodes and the desire to ban the traditional Mass. Again, he's a progressive, meaning left modernist, lay theologian who is a consultor at the Vatican on liturgical matters. He is clearly working with Archbishop or Cardinal Roche and Archbishop Viola and all these other characters who are at this moment trying to ban the traditional Mass. And the interviewer managed to ask him some couple very hard questions at the beginning that I want to focus on today. The interview is here is what they're basically asking. In the first question, they say, Why, as it appears to us, does it seem that at all costs there is no desire to give free space in the Catholic Church to traditionalists who are faithful to Rome, like so many other lay movements, and that they only regard as faithful to be re-educated? Now, that may sound like a loaded question, but a lot of this depends on how you view Rome. Do you view Rome as the political ecclesiastical apparatus, or do you view Rome in some way closer to what Archbishop Lefebvre did when he was having the height of his disputes with the Vatican in the 70s, in the late 70s, until his passing in the 90s? He referred to being loyal to eternal Rome, to the timeless faith, to the deposit of faith in the magisterium that will outlast all of these modernists. Where is it that your loyalty is? To the earthly institution, or to the magisterial authority in a beyond our natural senses, the invocation of the Holy Spirit and its influence on the church and all of this? That's where this division is. I'm sure somebody like Kennedy Hall could express what I just said in a much smoother way, because he is much more charismatic and better communicator than I am on this. And he's been touching on the subject himself. But I'm going to show you here. They asked him this question, and it was frankly loaded. It was a loaded question. And to his credit, Professor Grillo doesn't hold back. Here's his response. The first question contains numerous inaccuracies that undermine the very meaning of the question. I will try to illustrate them one by one. Those you call traditionalists faithful in Rome are actually people who, for various reasons, are at odds with Rome and not in a relationship of fidelity. The point of contention does not simply concern a ritual form, but a way of understanding relations inside and outside the church. It all begins with the misunderstanding generated, in good faith but through a completely wrong judgment, by the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. So division of the church is the fault of Benedict XVI, which had introduced a, quote, ritual parallelism between the Novus Ordo and the Vetus Ordo, the Mass at the Ages, the traditional Mass, that is neither a systematic nor practical foundation. It is not theologically sound and generates greater divisions than those that were present previously. In a sense, he's not wrong. Hardline traditionalists will admit you cannot have two expressions of the Roman Rite parallel on equal footing. It's a complicated argument, but he's not exactly wrong here. The idea of fidelity to Rome must be challenged. To be faithful to Rome, one must acquire a ritual language according to what Rome has communally established. One is not faithful if one has one foot in two shoes. Having demonstrated this contradiction, the merit of Traditionis Custodes is that it reestablishes the one lex orandi in force for the entire Catholic Church. If someone tells me he is faithful at the same time to the Novus Ordo and Vetus Ordo, I reply that he has not understood the meaning of tradition, within which there are a legitimate and inseparable progress that is irreversible. His view of tradition is what they call the living tradition, which is different than when we say living tradition. When they say living tradition, they mean a tradition that doesn't have necessarily binding force, because they take the concept of the development of doctrine and they run wild with it. They believe tradition, it progresses. They'll point to some things over history, like the way the rosary changed in the Middle Ages and where it came from. And then they will compare that to the contradictions in the Vatican II documents with pre-conciliar stances on things, most noteworthily on freedom of religion and a few other things. But if you stand in what they call what they call legitimate and inseparable progress that is irreversible, you are not a good Catholic. Go back to that document that Francis is in the process of issuing, changing papal primacy, the study document, which is just which is a sort of a church way, if you want to call it that, more of a university way of having something that would be better called a mission statement. Now they hit back, the interviewer does, and says, after the Paris Chartres 2024 pilgrimage with 18,000 people, an average of age of 25, diocesan bishops, a cardinal of the Holy Roman Church, and extensive media coverage, do you believe that the church must now consider pastoral care for the traditional charism as well, like other movements that have risen since Vatican II, or can it continue to deny the massive vitality of the ancient liturgy? He's invoking there that proposal that I warned people was a terrible idea, and I was glad to see others do it. This idea of creating a special sort of separation for the traditional Mass. Think the Anglican ordinariate, creating an ordinariate for it. So you would have a bishop or three overseeing the FSSP, the Institute Christ the King, potentially the SSPX and other similar groups, and they can place their parishes wherever they want, but they have canonical jurisdiction given them by Rome, but they're a special case. And he's invoking that pilgrimage that happened just a month ago. Those of you who watched The Remnant with Michael Matt know full well how popular this thing is, and it grows every single year. Here's his response. What are 18,000 people compared to the great multitude of the Catholic Church? Little more than a sect that experiences infidelity as salvation and is often linked to moral and political positions and very concerning customs. It isn't by changing words that things get better. Tradition and traditionalism cannot be equated. Traditionalism is not, quote, one among many movements, even though it may have characteristics that are partly similar to some of the more fundamentalist movements that were inappropriately favored over the last 40 years, but a form of denial of the Second Vatican Council that cannot be clearly obstructed within the ecclesial experience. The Church is not a club of notaries or lawyers who cultivate their aesthetic passions or plan to instrumentalize the Church as the most famous museum. End quote. That is the foremost liturgical consultor to the Vatican, one of the architects of the coming liturgical ban, who denigrates all those folks on that pilgrimage, a pilgrimage that everybody watching this probably would love to have been able to go on if they were physically able to, either because of their physical health or not able to go to because they just couldn't get to Paris. We would all have loved to have gone on. It is a beautiful expression of faith. When you see the footage of it, people praying constantly as they walk on that long pilgrimage. They are schismatics, according to him. And he is a consultor to the dicastery for divine worship, which is where this Latin Mass ban will be coming from, assuming that Rurate's source is correct, when they've been right 100% of the time on liturgical issues. That's what we're dealing with. And that interview gets way better from there. I'll be probably bringing more of that to you tomorrow because, again, they're not going to be satisfied when they're done with us. Anthony Abbott from Avoiding Babylon tells us they always tell us we're only a fraction of a percent. If that is true, why are they so afraid of us? And I saw Dr. Kwasniewski post this on, I think, Facebook yesterday, or maybe it's on Twitter. He said, according to all the statistics of the growth of the Latin Mass and the incredible attrition rate at the typical Novus Ordo ordinary form parish, which is something like 85% among the young people, it's something staggeringly high, that when you start looking at it, by about the mid-2060s is when, if the Latin Mass was allowed to grow organically, it would pass the Novus Ordo, mid-2060s. 40 years is a long time, though. So why are they so afraid? Because this is where the vocations are. That's one of the things that interview goes into, is vocations. Because that's where the vocations are. And their view of the church is to change its orientation to the secular world. It's been like that since the 60s. Think about it this way. One of the most eye-opening images you will ever see is of Pope Paul VI laying down the papal tiara. It's a surrender of the church's earthly authority. Most traditionalists are against that, to put it mildly. That act was more than just symbolic. It was the church surrendering on those issues. And that's why you started having popes travel all the time, going to the UN, doing all these other things, and essentially endorsing the most Catholic-friendly faction in the secular world at the time, while also, weirdly, not speaking out against the other side. Vatican II was supposed to have, as one of its discussions topics, was an unequivocal, infallible, on the church's authority, magisterial authority, infallible condemnation of the hammer and sickle, the ideology of Karl Marx. And because of ecumenical reasons, they said no to doing that. We reap the whirlwind. He replies, "Fear not, these modernists are a passing breed. Our children and grandchildren will see the restoration. Almost certainly, especially if our suspicions about a material chastisement are absolutely correct." Whip Tip says they're looking for the right time. When the modernists feel that they are ready, Trads will be excommunicated from the Novus Ordo, but the joke is on them. God is in control. And that is something to remember. I think their time running the church is directly tied to that period that Leo XIII saw or heard in the conversation between our Lord and Satan, that they have 100 years to destroy the church. When that 100-year period started, we don't know. But I suspect their time is running out. Phillips, there's still time to plan your pilgrimage to Covadonga July 27th and 29th. Make a statement. Well, there is one for you if you are able to go. I'm in no physical condition to be doing long pilgrimages. But yes, so there's one to go. All right, folks. Any final thoughts in the live chat? If there are, this is your time to get them in. Please hit the like button if you can. That would be, if you haven't already, it would be greatly appreciated. Mike likes Mike Rizzo likes my optimism. I have to have optimism. I've got young children. I have to. All right, folks. Let's see. Thanks very much for tuning in today, folks. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.